There was a famous experiment done in the 60s called the Milgram experiment. And in this experiment, they wanted to see how far people would go in obeying commands from authority. And so they picked a person who was their subject, and they had an actor who played the person on the other side of the wall that the subject was asking questions to. And you'd ask questions to this actor, and every time that they got the wrong answer, they were instructed to give an electrical shock to the person they were questioning. And so it kept going until eventually the shocking became so strong, they would increase the shock every time. And then it got to the point where it was so strong that the person from the other side of the wall was screaming, please, please stop, please, it hurts so bad. And the guy just kept going. The subject kept going in asking the questions because the researcher would just say, please move on to the next question. Even when he thought there was a chance the guy was dead, he kept going. And so the whole point was to see how far people would go, how far people would just blindly follow commands that were given from someone in authority. And we look at that and we go, man, that's just it's insane. Who would ever do that? And yet, if we probably stopped and thought about it, there's some things that we would follow blindly and not really think about the consequences all that much, especially when it's from somebody in authority. Unfortunately, that's not always true when it comes to God. Now, if you have been in church any time of your life, for 5 minutes in your life, you've heard that it said that God is the ultimate authority. If you claim to be a Jesus follower, then God is the ultimate authority in your life. And yet, when God gives commands, rarely do we follow blindly. Rarely do we say, okay, and we get up and we do whatever it is. Rarely, or often, we're more like a Moses. And not to get too far ahead in the story, because we'll be there in a few weeks, but more often than not, we are a Moses, where God says, this is what I want you to do, and we come back with a, yeah, but, what about? And we come up with a whole long list of excuses of why we can't or why we shouldn't. Rarely are we a Noah, which is where we are this week in moving through the story, moving through the Bible from beginning to end. And again, remember that we're not just moving through the Bible just to do it or just to check it off a list, but our goal is to try to understand our story within His story. We read the Old Testament, we read these pages, but what does it mean to us? How are we supposed to live this? If you remember, chapter 1 sets the stage. It sets the stage for the story that we're about to enter into. How there was nothing. There was darkness and empty void. And then God said, let there be light. And God speaks everything into creation. Really, in chapter 1, we're introduced to the protagonist, which is God. He is the main character in this story of the Bible. And then you get to chapter 2, and chapter 2 zooms in on a very particular event during the creation. And this is where the story of God and His people begin. Unfortunately, it's also the introduction of the antagonist, which would be Satan. Of course, there's always supporting characters in the story, and if you don't know by now, the supporting characters in the story are people. It's us. We are the supporting characters in God's story. Here's something that you need to learn about life, that we all need to remember about life in regards to living as a Christian, and is this: in God's story, we are just supporting characters. We are not the main character. Life is not about us, and this world does not revolve around me. Our lives are supposed to revolve around God. God is the main character in His story. And so we're introduced to the protagonist, God, in chapter 1. We're introduced to the antagonist, Satan, in chapter 2. And as we turn the pages to Genesis chapter 3, sin and its effects keep growing. Adam and Eve are thrown out of the garden. Cain kills Abel, all out of jealousy. And sin and rebellion start spreading like wildfire. So much so that before we get too far into the story, only 3 chapters later, God feels the need to destroy the whole world. Only 6 chapters into the story, and we read these verses. The Lord observed the extent of human wickedness on the earth, and He saw that everything they thought or imagined was consistently and totally evil. So the Lord was sorry He had made them and put them on the earth. It broke His heart. And the Lord said, I will wipe this human race I have created from the face of the earth. Yes, I will destroy every living thing, all the people, the large animals, the small animals that scurry along the ground, and even the birds of the sky, because I am sorry I ever made them. It says that every thought, everything was consistently and totally evil. I mean, that's tough. I don't think we grasp how terrible the world was before the flood. The creatures whom God made into his image to be his representatives on earth had become so twisted that God felt he had to destroy it. And just as he said, let there be light, and there was light, he could have said, let this be done. This is over, and boom, it's over. But see, God is a God of restoration. He takes the things that are broken and he puts them back together again. He sees the world, the broken creation, and instead of finishing it and being done, we're introduced to someone. And the way we're introduced is by these words. But Noah found favor with the Lord. So, what do we know about Noah? Well, he's probably, if not the most popular character to talk about in VBS or children's Bible class. He's at least the top 3, right? We know that Noah was an old man. We know that God comes and tells Noah and his family to build an ark. And Noah does so. See, I talked about blindly following commands from authority and how sometimes, or more often than not, we're more like a Moses and we're not like a Noah. Noah blindly followed God. God came along and said, build an ark. And Noah did so. You do realize that Noah is simply doing what Adam didn't do, don't you? I mean, God came and told Adam, don't eat from that tree. And he said, okay. And then what did he do? He let Eve eat from the tree, and then he ate from the tree. The one thing God said don't do, and that's what he did. God comes along to Noah and says, Noah, build an ark. Noah says, okay. And he obeys him. And because of his obedience, God fixes the brokenness. God's intentions for the world and his people would start over. I'd like to think of this as the end of Act 1 and Act 2 is starting. Again, I like to think in terms of movies, of plays. And if you read a script, you know that there's Act 1, there's Act 2, Act 3, and so forth and so on. I like to think of this as the end of Act 1 and Act 2 is starting. God comes and says, build an ark. Now, the Hebrew word for ark is interesting. The Hebrew word for ark means box. It means box. And there's 2 different words. One basically means a box that goes underground or above ground to store things in, and the other one means a box that goes underground, or it can mean underground. The same word is used when talking about Moses. When his mother put him in a basket, that same word was basket and flowed him down the river. The same word that's translated as ark. But in some cases, it means a box that goes underground, which is what? A coffin. So imagine if God came down and said, Timmy, I don't know if there's a Timmy watching or not, but it's the first thing that came to my mind, so we're going to go with that. If God came down and said, Timmy, here's some specs I want you to build. It's just, don't worry about it. Just some specs on something I want you to build. And you say, oh, well, what is it, God? And he says, oh, it's your coffin. I'm sorry, it's my what? It's your box that we're going to put you in. A box? For what? You get to verse 6, starting in verse 18, or chapter 6, starting in verse 18. God says, in verse 17. Look, I'm about to cover the earth with a flood that will destroy every living thing that breathes. Everything on earth will die. But I will confirm my covenant with you. So enter the boat, you and your wife and your sons and their wives. Bring a pair of every kind of animal, a male and a female, into the boat with you to keep them alive during the flood. Pairs of every kind of bird and every kind of animal and every kind of small animal that scurries along the ground will come to you to be kept alive. And be sure to take on board enough food for your family and for all the animals. And verse 22 says, so Noah did everything exactly as God had commanded him. Moses worked on the ark for maybe 60 to 70 years or so. working, gathering, building, collecting food, and of course, collecting the animals. No matter what God told Noah, more than once it says Noah did everything just as God commanded him. Even when people thought he was crazy, Noah did everything just as God commanded him. Everybody laughed at him. Everybody pointed. Everybody, what are you doing, Noah? I'm building an ark. There's going to be a flood. A flood? You know, there's some scholars believe that it actually had not rained before this point. I'm not sure if that's accurate or not, because I'm not sure how the plants and things would have grown. But they believed that there was more of a mist, like a continual mist that would fall. And so this idea of a flood coming that would flood the entire world and kill everything was something that was just foreign to them. They laughed at him because this was the most outlandish thing they had ever heard in their entire lives. Regardless if they had experienced rain like we know it today or not, the fact is that Noah did everything that God commanded him to do. And then the rain started falling. And then it rained for 40 days and for 40 nights. For 150 days, water was over the earth. 1 year, they were locked in the ark. And then in chapter 9, we read, Then God blessed Noah and his sons and told them, Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth. All the animals of the earth, all the birds in the sky, all the small animals that scurry along the ground, and all the fish in the sea will look on you with fear and terror. I have placed them in your power. I have given them to you for food, just as I have given you grain and vegetables. But you must never eat any meat that still has the lifeblood in it. And I will require the blood of anyone who takes another person's life. If a wild animal kills a person, it must die. And if anyone who murders a fellow human must die. If anyone takes a human life, that person's life will also be taken by human hands. For God made human beings in his own image. Now be fruitful and multiply and repopulate the earth. Then God told Noah and his sons, I hereby confirm my covenant with you and your descendants, and with all the animals that were on the boat with you, the birds, the livestock, and all the wild animals, every living creature on earth. Yes, I am confirming my covenant with you. Never again will floodwaters kill all living creatures. Never again will a flood destroy the earth. Then God said, I am giving you a sign of my covenant with you and all living creatures for all generations to come. I have placed my rainbow in the clouds. It is the sign of my covenant with you and with all the earth. When I send clouds over the earth, the rainbow will appear in the clouds, and I will remember my covenant with you and with all living creatures. Never again will the floodwaters destroy all life. When I see the rainbow in the clouds, I will remember the eternal covenant between God and every living creature on earth. Then God said to Noah, Yes, this rainbow is the sign of the covenant I am confirming with all the creatures on earth. God floods the earth, destroys everything except Noah and his family. And then God, being God, the God of restoration, the God of love, the God of fixing what is broken, then puts another covenant in place with Noah. Another agreement. He had one with Adam and Eve and they broke it. But he comes back with Noah and he puts another agreement in place and says, This is what I'm promising you. And you think that the horror of the flood would cause Noah's descendants to live in obedience. You would think that hearing the stories and knowing what great-great-great-grandpa Noah told us about the flood, you would think that that would straighten them up. But soon after the flood, we find humanity joined together in rebellion against God once again. And this time, they're together at Babel, and they have this plan that they're going to build a tower to the heavens so that they could make a name for themselves. They wanted to be equal with God. And once again, God looks down on humanity's decision to declare independence from him, and he destroys the fruit of their rebellion. But this time, instead of wiping them out, he scatters them. He confuses their language and scatters them throughout the earth. And as we come to the end of Genesis chapter 11, God's intention for humanity seems so far away from what God intended in the beginning. Their ability to accurately represent God on earth, to live as his image bearers, which is what he originally intended, is in serious question. But God is a God who fixes brokenness. And he's done it time and time again. And he still does it even to this day. He fixed my brokenness. No one is outside his reach. Not only did he fix my brokenness, but he continually fixes me each and every day. He renews me, he restores me. He hears me, and he loves me. And if he loves me, I'm telling you, he loves you too. If he can fix me, no one is outside of his reach. And he does it in such a way that the world looks at us and says, no way. No way. See, you used to look like this. You used to look broken and shattered and unrepairable. And yet, look at you now. Look at the amazing things you're doing. Look at the way you're living your life. Look at what is this joy that you're living your life with? What is going on with you? They look at us and they see something that's impossible. And all we have to do is simply reflect God to them as a product of a God who fixes brokenness. That's how much God loves us. That's how much he's always loved us. That's what we see in this story. Is a God that, let me stop right there and say this. The flood is something that I used to have a problem with. And the flood is one of those stories that a lot of, well, I would say a lot of non-Christians, but I mean, heck, Christians have a hard time with it. They look at a story of a God who would destroy the entire world, of a God who would kill everything except for one family. And they see an angry God, an vengeful God, and just an awful God, and they don't want anything to do with that God. But instead of seeing that part, instead of honing in on the destruction and the death, we should be able to see a God who, even when his entire creation, every thought, every action was evil, God still wanted to fix it. God still wanted to repair what was broken. That even in the face of active rebellion, God wanted to have a relationship with his creation. That even when God is powerful enough to snap his fingers and everything is gone, he chooses, he loves us so much that he chooses to fix what is broken. That is the God that we see in this story. Is that a God that chooses to love his creation so much, and so he repairs it time and time and time and time again. As we move through Genesis, you're going to see, even in this first book, there's time and times and over again where God has to pull his creation back to him, to restore what was broken. And then, oh my goodness, when you get into Exodus and you see that the Israelites wandering in the desert, how many times they were like a kid with a shiny object, oh, okay, let's go with God. Ooh, and they're over here, and God's like, what are you doing? I got to fix this again. And then you get to Judges. Oh my goodness, Judges. He'd send somebody to come and deliver Israel and come and do some incredible things. And it would say that this judge ruled over Israel for X amount of years, and Israel did everything right in the eyes of the Lord. And then when they died, Israel went back to what they were doing before. They wandered away from God. Time and time again. And we see this in the story, and we're like, that's insane. But yet we are those people. We are Israel. Time and time again, we wander away. Time and time again, we see the shiny object, and we're over here like this. And yet God is a God who fixes brokenness. So if you're broke, it's okay. If you're broken, that's all right. If you say I'm too far outside of God's reach, no one is outside of God's reach. The world, God's creation, every thought every inclination was evil, and yet God found a way to fix what was broken. Let's end our time together in prayer. Father, I thank you so much for the promises we find in your word. God, I thank you for being a God who is loving and gracious, to not leave us to our own choices, our own mistakes, but you are a God who fixes what is broken. God, thank you for loving us enough to repair us, to restore us. God, help us to walk in the light of your love, and help us to stay focused on you even when other things are pulling us in so many different directions. We love you, God, and we thank you for all things. In your son's name we pray. Amen. Have a blessed week.